Week number 3 of our study on the meaning of marriage. And we're using the word week versus chapter, although we are in chapter number 3 in the book, because as you know, and some of you may remember this, we are combining or bringing together not only the book, but also the audio podcast and also the conversation or discussion videos that we find on YouTube. Now, if you are connecting or you are utilizing this means or this presentation for the first time, I want to give you the overview and reminds us on what is it that we are doing. And we are basically studying or walking through the book from Tim and Kathy Keller on marriage. So let me see if I can give you the overview here. Well, I'll give you the title first, and then I'll give you the overview. What you see on the screen is just the title, The Meaning of Marriage, Facing the Complexities of Commitment with the Wisdom of God. And again, this is from Tim and Kathy Keller. Today, we're looking at chapter 3, which is basically the essence of marriage. So we're going to walk through an outline of the chapter of the book. But at the same time, and this is why I wanted to mention also the remaining of the resources that we're using. If you remember, we're also, and let me put it on the screen or share it with you on the screen, because we're also using and the again the package, the full package of the resources that we have found when it comes to the presentation of this material, which personally I think is one of the best that I have ever seen when it comes to marriage and relationships. So whether you are single, you are married, or you're single again, this is one of the best resources. And again, what you see on the screen is basically just the combination of those three resources that I mentioned. So on the left column, you're going to see the book, and today is week 3. So we're looking at the essence of marriage, and then it goes parallel in this case with episode 4 of the actual audio podcast. The audio podcast is basically the sermon series that Tim Keller preached back in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And for what I understand, this is one of the most popular sermon series that he made or did back then. So episode 4 is marriage as commitment and priority. So obviously is the overlapping of the book and also the sermon series. And then there is no discussion video, which is the column on the right. And for this week or for chapter 3 or episode 4, there is no discussion video. So either way, I'd love for you guys to stick around and simply spend time with us as we navigate some of these principles today when it comes to the essence of marriage. Now, in the ideal world, this is my recommendation. I don't know if you're able to do it, but I would love for you guys to do that. I would love for you guys to actually get a hold of the book and make sure that you read the chapter prior to watching this video. Why? Because this video is simply a synthesis, a compressed presentation of the chapter in the book. But in reality, what we're looking for, what we want to do is to spend time in the book so everybody can take ownership of the exposition and actually spend time on it. And hopefully, like anything else, we use this as a springboard towards conversations, towards growing in maturity, but specifically as we relate to others, whether it's again in our own marriages, dating relationships, singleness. We're going to talk about singles also within the book, because the book actually presents one chapter, if I'm not mistaken, is one chapter in single for singles. And so again, whether you're raising singles, whether you have little ones at home, whether you are single yourself, you may be a single mom, whatever the case may be, this is helpful biblical material, and I hope and you guys agree with me on that. So again, thank you for being here today, and let me just walk you through briefly, because the time is always a challenge, and time is always it's a gift that you guys allows us to spend it together. So let me just walk you through a couple of the major principles that he is going to discuss, meaning Tim and Kathy Keller, when it comes to the chapter. The thesis of the chapter is basically the essence of biblical marriage is, and here's the key word, covenantal love. And it seems to me that the Bible presents those two words as synonyms. Is love in the context of covenant rather than merely romantic attraction. Now, marriage is going to flourish, which I'm assuming that's the purpose of marriage, right? Oneness, to build a life in oneness. Not because emotions remain constant, but because two people willingly bind themselves to one another through covenantal promises before God. It seems to me that what he's going to remind us is that God is the object of that covenant. So this is beyond just two people loving each other. This is beyond two people simply fulfilling, their dreams and desires and walking in oneness. I think that's extremely important and is part of the package or the experience. But at the end of the day, since this is God's design and this is God's idea, then obviously what we want is to keep God as the object of that marriage. We'll talk about that in just a second. Genuine love is sustained by commitment. The word sustain, again, is extremely important because it seems to me that love fluctuates, especially when it's based and grounded in emotions primarily. So in this case, must be grounded, founded, and built upon commitment. And commitment becomes the environment or the DNA in which authentic love actually grows. So, once again, a growing, loving relationship, a growing marriage, it seems to me that this is symptomatic. That is not the goal. I'm thinking through the lenses of church revitalization and church health, which is typically what we do in a sense of, what we invest our lives in ministry by helping churches to remain healthy or to get healthy. And it seems to me that the health of the church or the stage of the church is the result of something else. So it's symptomatic. So at the end of the day, the question is, or based on what we're discussing, it seems to me that when the relationship or the love is built in commitment, then growth and oneness happens as a result of that experience versus the other way around is when in church life is when you try to simply grow the church, when you try to avoid stagnation or decline in the life of the church at the expense of ignoring the root, the foundation, the grounds, or the object of that growth and result. And this is why a lot of times in church life, tragically, we depend on strategies, we depend on charisma and leadership skills as the foundation. And I don't think the Bible opposes those things, but the Bible does not present the health of the church or the growth of a church based on those um, areas or items. I think at the end of the day is the result of something else. And for us, the something else, obviously, in church life is proper ecclesiology, proper theology translated into a life, speaking of the church, a life of selflessness and rediscovering of the mission in a church that is willing to be committed to the mission of the church. So I think that's exactly the same thing that happens in marriage. In marriage, whatever is going on in marriage, to me, that's the symptom. Whatever you see, whatever you feel, whatever you experience, legit. I'm not minimizing whatever marriages are right now, but at the end of the day, it seems to me, based on the introduction or the thesis of the chapter, that those are simply the symptoms. So be very careful because when you go to the doctor, typically what brings you to the doctor to be seen by a doctor are the symptoms, and they are necessary. Thank you, Jesus, for symptoms, because if you didn't feel it, if you didn't see the symptoms of whatever is taking place, now the doctor is going to find out and deal with the real issue. And typically, it's something that requires a deeper examination, a deeper experience, in this case in the medical field. For us, it's exactly the same thing in marriage. So please make sure that we do not exchange symptoms with the actual issue of, in this case, of the marriage, of the relationship. Now, the invitation is that we look at some of these discussion questions because the ideal is not simply to consume the content or to read the book, but actually is to walk together into the conversations, obviously as married couples, and then potentially with other people in the in the journey of this study. So I'm not going to read the questions to you; they're in front of you, and I love to get all this material to you. So let me know if you'd like to get a copy of the actual presentation or the outline for today. But again, my desire, I mean, literally, is get the book. Get a copy of the book, read the book. I love to send you the links of the audio podcast or the sermon series. You can Google it. I mean, it's just the title of the book. That's exactly the same thing, that the meaning of marriage. And again, I love for you guys to get some of these questions within the conversation. And if you're using this video for a small group, definitely will help you to get the dialogue taking place and going on. Key biblical passages. This is found grounded in the Bible, obviously. And again, pastors, if you want to build a marriage series, when it comes to biblical references, here you have them. And again, they're taken straight from the book. So I love for you guys to also just take advantage and read some of these passages together. Just meditate on them. We're not going to dissect those passages. Again, that's what he does in the actual sermon series. So again, I love for you guys to listen to the sermon series as well. But in this case, the whole series is based on Ephesians 5. That's where it's based. But again, these are passages that will help you to get the conversation moving, and as part of the, again, parallel messages when it comes to, specifically when it comes to the essence of marriage, which is chapter 3, what we're looking at today. Now, he begins by speaking of the modern misunderstanding of love. This is where it gets fun. This is where he gets really convicted, a lot of conviction, because typically in culture, the concept is that marriage as only a piece of paper. So, cultural assumptions that we see in our generation today: love is viewed primarily as an emotion. Legal commitment is considered unnecessary because, again, we are so driven by emotions. So there is no need for legal engagement or legal commitments. Marriage is seen as optional. The experience of marriage, or the legality of marriage, or the, again, the engagement of marriage, and then personal happiness becomes the highest value. I think this is something that allows us to really get a true and genuine diagnose of where we are today. And unfortunately, this mindset or worldview has become so normative that not only Hollywood promotes it, but it's a matter of celebration. Now, one of the things that he's going to say, Tim Keller, when it comes to the whole sermon series, is that tragically we have made, and I don't know if this is from this series or other sermons, but we have made marriage the capstone, when in reality marriage is presented as a cornerstone, meaning that this is not the greatest or supreme experience on this earth or in this life. And as important as marriage is, again, marriage becomes a megaphone, is the announcement of the real marriage. And by default, if our marriages are simply proclaiming, announcing, preparing the way for the real marriage, which is the marriage between Jesus and the church in the final day, the marriage, the wedding of the Lamb, then the implication is that marriage, in reality, what it is simply an incarnation, expression, exemplification of the relationship between Jesus and his church. What's the point? The point is that this is pure evangelism. Marriage is pure discipleship because we're proclaiming the marriage of someone else. Versus when we move through cultural assumptions, which is what you see on the screen, again, we make our marriages the win. We make our relationship the goal. That's why we're saying that it's not a capstone, it's not the climax, it's not the pinnacle, it's the concept of Jerry Maguire. You complete me, right? And I just quoted a movie. I'm always concerned about quoting movies because then it sounds like I'm promoting the movie. But back in the day, this concept of completion, soulmates, completely nonsensical, completely out of biblical understanding. Why? Because if there is such a thing as a soulmate, then soulmate is the person that you marry. I'm going to say it again. Your soulmate is the person that you married. And I'm using married with a past tense because you're already married. Now, if you are not married, then please move away from this fallacy to think that there is someone up there somewhere divinely appointed to you. I believe that if you live a life of righteousness, if you follow Jesus and stop following this nonsensical mindset of our cultural assumptions, I believe that eventually you will attract not only what you know, meaning when you know the scriptures, but also who you are. So remember the whole phrase of it takes one to know one, kind of at the same mindset. So ultimately, I have to become the person that I hope to marry, the person that I hope to attract for marriage. So in this case, be aware of the falsification, the counterfeit mindset when it comes to the definition of marriage. And in this case, that is only a piece of paper. Common cultural statements: if we truly love each other, we don't need marriage. Implication: cohabitation, right? Marriage ruins romance. My God, this is crazy because once again, what the chapter is implying, that the pinnacle, the climax of life is emotions, is that emotions is the driving force of our lives. Commitment limits freedom. Wow. Yeah, it is the concept that at the end of the day is about you, is your autonomy, is whatever makes you happy. And this is why he's going to respond, the author, Tim Keller, is going to respond, the problem is not marriage itself, but a deficient understanding of love. So, once again, from symptomatics or symptoms to the actual issue. The issue is not marriage, or in this case, tragically, the redefinition of marriage. The issue is the understanding of what love actually is. Now, biblical love is much deeper than simply emotional attraction. So, now let me make a quick parenthesis here. And this is huge for me when it comes to the conversation of love, and in this case of marriage, because and I have illustrated this in the past. I don't have the picture. I should have probably brought the picture and show it to you, but I don't have it with me. But I'm thinking of a train. And if I can illustrate that, I don't have anything here with me, but if you can think of a train, in the train you have the engine, you have the cards, and then you have the caboose, which is the last of the train. So if you can think through the lenses of illustrating the life of a person, or in this case, the life of a Christian, but it's not simply a Christian, it's a person that when it comes to the engine, what is supposed to be the leading force, is supposed to be the catalyst, is supposed to be the one setting the agenda, or that's when the power is found, that will be the spirit of the individual, the spiritual component, because we're a unit, right? We don't have a spirit, we are a spirit. So this is the place, this is where salvation takes place instantly. That's when the individual, goes from deadness into life, from darkness into light, when the Holy Spirit, through the exposition of the Bible, takes place and does the miraculous experience of coming to know Christ. And then you can potentially illustrate the cards of the train as your intellect. This is where now this is where you start seeing the changing and the progressive changes of how you think, and how Paul says in Romans, is the renewal of your mind. And then the caboose, which is the last one, I will say those are the emotions or the feelings. So all that I'm trying to tell you is that when you come to know Christ, is the entire train that is saved and transformed and regenerated. Instantly, the entire individual is transformed. But simultaneously, as much as you are instantly and completely transformed, simultaneously, you are progressively transformed. So, once again, spirit wise, your engine automatically is replaced, is taken over. You are legally bound now to the presence of the Spirit of Jesus, which is the Holy Spirit. But then progressively, your thinking is being shaped through the thinking of Jesus, through the presentation of the scriptures, and then eventually your emotion. Now, here's my point. The point that I'm trying to make is what he's discussing, Tim Keller is discussing at the beginning of the chapter, when he exposes the fallacy and the counterfeit mindset of the concept of marriage and the concept of love, is simply a generation that has reversed the order of the train, that instead of being led by the engine, which is the spirit of the living God, which we're supposedly our thinking submits to the spirit. So whatever we're thinking, our thoughts must be captive or being under the spirit of the living God, and then also our emotions. So the Bible does not oppose emotions. It's simply that there's going to be under the leadership and the fullness and the lordship of the spirit of the living God. The moment that you reverse the order, and now your life, now your mindset is led by the caboose, that implies that you're still a Christian, but this is the type of Christian that now you're thinking, and also your spirituality or your spirit is going to be led by what you feel. And that's where the danger begins. Why? This is why. And I'll just give you a quick example. So I'm thinking through the lenses also of how our culture tragically today perceives or translates the concept of sexuality. In our culture today, I get the impression that culture says that when it comes to sex, that's who you are. So whatever your sexual preferences are, whether it's sexual attraction for the opposite sex, whether it's the sexual attraction for same sex, or whatever the case may be, whatever other definition of sexual attraction you can potentially have, at the end of the day, culture says that's who you are. That's where your sexual, again, preferences define your identity. The Bible presents sexuality not as who we are, but what we do. And the implication is that, once again, think of emotions. When it comes to emotions, as important as they are, they cannot become the driving force of our lives. I think that's exactly why we are in the mess that we are today when it comes to relationships, when it comes to allowing our egocentric mindset define relationships and define how we deal with parenting and grandparenting and dating and eventually marriage or whatever other relationship, if you allowed your emotions to dictate, then yeah, you're going to be slaved. You're going to depend on something that is extremely fragile and was not designed to become the driving force. So, based on that, now the biblical definition of love. Love is more than emotion. It does include emotions, but it's more than that. So, what is love? Well, I'm glad you asked. Modern culture defines love as passion, attraction, chemistry, and emotional intensity. Have you noticed that great sex happens, according to Hollywood, between single people? Outside of marriage, that's what great sex happens because it's defined by, once again, the caboose, right? The emotional component. The scripture defines love as self-giving, sacrifice, faithfulness, service, and covenant. Ultimately, love is fundamentally an act of the will that produces lasting affections over time. Now, just to be very clear, when it comes to this, to the definition of the Bible, when it comes to love, I just want you to look at the list one more time: self-giving, sacrifice, faithfulness, service, and covenant. Do you do you agree with me? Would you agree with me that these are the qualifiers? These are the descriptions of the person of Jesus? In other words, as much as we are called to self-give ourselves, as much as we're called to sacrifice and to be faithful and to be people of service instead of serve me, and be people of covenant or perseverance, and as much as we are, but in reality, those are the descriptions of one individual, and his name is Jesus, because he is love. He is the one who loved us. And again, the beauty of this, and we're going to see this in just a second, Jesus loved the church when the church was not lovable. I'm gonna say it again. Jesus didn't simply love the church because the church deserved to be loved. See, this is the concept in church revitalization again, coming back to the health of the church. See, when it comes to the church coming back or reconnecting to the mission, to the purpose why the church is the church, it needs to be led, it needs to be governed. I'm speaking of the pastor or pastors or revitalizers, by loving and shepherding the real church, not the ideal church. So translate that in the person of Jesus. When it comes to Jesus loving the church, loving you, loving us, he did not love the future version of ourselves. He loved us when we were still yet sinners. Jesus died, loved us. So I think that's exactly the same thing that the Bible is describing when it comes to relationships. Is the concept of loving each other based on a decision, not simply the caboose. So that decision, and going back to the train, those carts that are led by the Spirit of the living God allows us to make a conscious, tangible decision that is translated by the submission and the incarnation of your feelings and making a choice to love in spite of what the caboose is telling you, or maybe the caboose is pulling in the opposite direction. You and I are willing to make a serious covenantal decision, once again, to be self-giving, to be sacrificed or sacrificial, to be faithful, to have a life of service and covenant. Now, listen to me for a second. If or when life is led by the caboose, this qualifiers, this descriptive statements of what love is according to the Bible becomes exactly the opposite. So now let's read through the list through the lenses of the caboose. When life is driven by our emotions, instead of self-giving, now I'm here and I'm sticking to the relationship as long as you give to me. Instead of being sacrificial or sacrifice, now I'm driven by entitlement. You owe me. And man, that is not going to work. What about faithfulness? See, this is the concept that now I'm going to stick around as long as you do X, Y, and Z. So I believe that marriage includes the concept of a contract, but it's more than a contract. It's contractual, but it's more, see, it's covenantal. And that's why faithfulness is non-negotiable. What about service? Again, from a life of service or servitude, now you move into a life of serve me. And then ultimately, once again, instead of being a covenant, now is based on this whole concept of 50-50, 100%. You do, I do, we do, I do, and then you move into a life of legalism. Well, that's not going to work. It's not going to last. No relationship is based on simply, see, again, you can think of a contract that you have with your cell phone company. This is more than that. It's got to be more than that. And that's why it's a covenant. So, and by the way, just a quick parenthesis, when it comes to covenant, you got to remember that covenant is precisely what God chose as the means of relating to his people. And if, or since, marriage is a megaphone that is proclaiming the true marriage that is to come at the end of time, which is the marriage between Jesus and his church. I'm speaking of, eschatological, final experience. This is where everything is moving to. Then the implication is that the final experience between Jesus and his church at the end of the age is based, is grounded, is promised on the fact of a covenant. Meaning, and again, I can go into I can start preaching definitely right now, because I'm thinking of Genesis chapter 15, specifically verse 17, when Abraham is asked in the middle of his vision. He's having a vision, and this encounter with God and having a covenant with God, making a covenant with God, or God making a covenant with Abraham, is that the one who actually walks through the sacrifice, the blood being shed, the pieces of the animal being torn into pieces, is actually God by himself. It's not God and Abraham. Abraham is simply an spectator. Abraham is the recipient of the covenant. So in this case, translate that into the life of marriage. Marriage is a covenant, and it's something that is beyond contractual. It does involve the emotions, it does involve the intellect, but it's simply a covenant not only between two individuals, but it's between the two individuals and the God of the Bible, who is the designer, who is the one who created for his very own purposes marriage. And I'm going to say it again. I am more than convinced that marriage is a megaphone announcing the real marriage. So if you are not a follower of Jesus, if you have not given your life to Jesus, it begins by coming into the covenantal relationship that took place on a Roman cross where blood was shed. And it wasn't Jesus and the disciples. It wasn't Jesus and the nation of Israel. It was Jesus alone. He is the perfect sacrifice. He's the fulfillment of the covenant, and he's the sustainer of the covenant. And he's the one that is coming back again for that final marriage based on a covenant. So as a church, as Christians, we're simply the recipient of that covenant. So everything that I just explained, I think marriage illustrates, and marriage is part of the reason why we got marriages, why we experience the beauty of marriage. Love involves promise. Love says, I will love you because I feel like it. Biblical covenant says, I will continue loving you even when my feelings, here we go, fluctuate. Why? Because the caboose is not supposed to lead the train. The engine is supposed to, again. So, in other words, fluctuation, inconsistency in feelings to a certain degree is natural. It's expected. We are broken vessels. No one has this thing figured out. And by the way, life life is unpredictable and everybody changes. But the beauty of this covenant is that I will continue to willfully. This is a volitional experience. This is out of the will. I'm choosing you over everyone else. I'm choosing you even when my feelings, once again, fluctuate. Therefore, feelings follow commitment, is the caboose that follows the engine through the cart. So you have to know what you believe and why you believe it, rather than commitment following feelings. I hope this is helpful. Number 3, consumer relationship versus covenant relationship or covenantal relationship. This is huge in here because look at the contrast. Consumer versus covenantal. One of Keller's, the author of the book, Central Distinctions, has to do with the consumer relationships, which implies here the distinctiveness of or the characteristics of this consumer relationship. People remain together only, once again, meism, egocentric mindset, consumeristic, autonomous. It's about me and it's all about me. Needs are met. I'm sticking around if my needs are met. I'm sticking around. I'm marrying to you if expectations are fulfilled, and then benefits exceed the cost. The questions asked now: what am I getting into this consumeristic mindset? Am I happy? And does this still work for me? The individual becomes more important than the relationship. Wow. Translate that into the life of the church. And today is Saturday. So as we approach church tomorrow, I'm going to argue that churches that are actually stagnant or moving into decline are churches who are driven, led, and the DNA is more of a consumeristic mindset. I'm sticking in this church as long as the church does X, Y, and Z. Is the mindset that at the end of the day, my salvation, or the purpose of my salvation is not for the health of the church. The purpose of my salvation is for me to find a church that serves me, for me to find a life that actually gives me a predictability and security. Because at the end of the day, the goal is to, I'm just being sarcastic, is to avoid hell and to go to heaven when I die. That is completely against not only scripture, but it's against the nature or the health of the church. Churches that are healthy, churches that are thriving or they're revitalized, are made and are created with the DNA and a culture of self-giving. That my contribution to the church, the reason why I am a Christian is for the health of the church. So now translate that into the life of marriage. What if the purpose of marriage, what if the purpose of this covenant is precisely the betterment or the health of my spouse? What if the reason why we are together and I chose you and you chose me is precisely so we can create and reproduce health, not only in a relationship with God, but with one another through the legacy of gospel presentation and disciple making in the nucleus of family relationships, meaning having children. And obviously, my implication, biblical worldview, is that we need to have children. I love pets. We truly miss Chucho. That's our dog that died a couple of years ago. We miss it, but this is not about pets. So please, young people, not only get married, but have kids. Have a lot of kids. That's my recommendation. Why? Because that's how the gospel moves from generation to generation. So again, speaking of churches, yes, we got to go to church. Yes, we must belong to a church. And yes, the church preaches the gospel. But ultimately, the preaching, the discipling, the formation of a worldview happens and takes place in the family nucleus through marriages that are actually driven by individuals who are willing to embrace the biblical worldview of relationships, or in this case, of love in the context of covenants. Um, when it comes to covenantal relationships, here is the contrast. Now, the characteristics is people remain together because they have promised faithfulness. Once again, this promise is driven by the engine, by the one who is the faithful one, who became the promise, right? Which is Jesus. The question now become, here's the question, and again, hear me say this. If you're single people, and especially you parents, we get the privilege to raise singles, here's what we are hoping, that we're praying for, that our family experience and how we model marriage actually is transferred and becomes a normative conversation when it comes to the questions that our kids, single individuals, are asking when they actually engage into relationships. How can I serve? How can I bless? How can I keep my promise? Now, once again, translate those questions into church life. Can you imagine tomorrow morning as people approach church, tomorrow morning as we gather for worship, that the driving force of our gathering are those questions instead of, why are you playing the music that I like? How come you're not doing X, Y? Well, see, again, because the opposite of these questions is a church that is divisive, polarized, polarization, a church that is driven by the caboose, by what they feel and what they want and self-interest. So, ideal picture, we want a generation of marriages, single people that learn these principles before they engage in marriage. The relationship becomes more important than immediate personal satisfaction. Can I say that again? The relationship, the covenantal relationship, is more important than what's in for me. Now, obviously, we're not implying, please hear me say this, we're not implying that you must become a martyr, that you are going to become an enabler of toxic relationship and abuse. There's a fine line between making the relationship the most important thing than simply looking for your own interests. What's the point? That there's a fine line between those who become enablers, those who tolerate abuse. So be very careful that the concept of the relationship, the concept of the marriage, if our marriages are simply a preamble to the real marriage, which is the marriage between Jesus and the church, then we have to make sure that we don't find our identity in our marriage. We don't find our identity on the acceptance or the rejection of our spouses. We have to make sure that we have to remind ourselves that our marriages are means to an end. There's a reason why, and this is just my interpretation of the Bible, there's a reason why there will be no marriage in heaven. There's a reason why, as much as we will be able to recognize one another, and there's mystery in what I'm about to say, at the same time, there will be no marital relationships, because I believe that our marriage on earth is simply preparing, is simply setting the ground, and then is the vehicle for what is to come, but also the vehicle to bring the gospel into other generations. Biblical marriage is covenant, is a covenant. Marriage mirrors God covenant with his people. Can I say that again? Marriage mirrors the covenant between God and his people. God in the Old Testament, God in the New Testament with the people of God. The characteristics, once again, is permanence, loyalty, forgiveness, sacrifice, and grace. And I'm going to say this once again. Because if you're like me, I'm trying to write this down, and I know I'm speaking fast because time is running out. And most of us, we're trying to fix our marriages, improve the situation. Hopefully I don't repeat the mistakes that I've made in the past. Hopefully I avoid divorce because I went through divorce once. Now hear me say this closely. Yes, we're called, what you see on the list on permanence and loyalty and forgiveness and sacrifice, all of those are mandates. They are not matters of prayer. It's not for discussion. It's not for a business meeting to see what people think. These are things that are the description, describing what a marriage through a biblical covenantal relationship looks like. But at the end of the day, I want to say this again and again and again and again. When it comes to the Christian life, one of the distinctiveness, when it comes to the exposition of the Bible, when it comes to the obedience of Christians to biblical principles, is always grounded based on the obedience of somebody else. All that I'm trying to say is the list that you see on the screen is describing the characteristics of Jesus of Nazareth. There is a reason, and I emphasize this on a weekly basis. There is a reason why Jesus could have not be born on Thursday and simply die on Friday, the next day, and then resurrected on Sunday. Because Jesus was not simply called to die for us, he needed to live also for us. And the life of Jesus, I believe, is portrayed to these descriptions, to the issue that the real person who actually is permanently our Savior, our Lord is Jesus. The one who is loyal is Jesus. The one who forgives is Jesus. The one who sacrifices is Jesus. The one who embodiments grace is the person of Jesus. And because he is, once again, he is our Savior and he's taking control of our lives, now we are stewards of this very same list in the context of marriage. Marriage, therefore, becomes a reflection of God's own faithfulness. Number four, the nature of biblical covenant. There's a horizontal covenant and there's also a vertical covenant. So in the horizontal, we are making promises from a husband to a wife and a wife to a husband. These vows establish mutual responsibility. This is one of the reasons that he is going to emphasize, and again, you got to read the book to get the full picture, but he emphasizes how when it comes to vows in marriage, you are making an appointment with a future version of yourself. In other words, in culture, typically vows are speaking of what you feel in that moment. And it's obvious that in wedding ceremonies, which are beautiful, and we as pastors, we love to do wedding ceremonies as much as they are necessary, there is a requirement for you to go through the actual formality and the covenant, and you gotta seal the deal. Hear me say this: the vows are a reflection of what is to come as much as it is to the moment that you're actually engaging. Why? Because what we just said, every marriage, Christian marriage, begins with the engine as the leading force. If you're going to be married in a Christian environment or Christian worldview, you begin with the engine and then you move to the cards, meaning the intellect. You're going to be fully conscious of what you're doing and what it means. And then obviously the emotions are part of it. But every single marriage eventually reverses the order. And when it comes to, once again, relationships and marriages that go through the fluctuation of seasons of life, droughts, struggles, just again, just life takes place. This is why you rekindle or you reconnect to the original purpose by reminding yourself that the vows that you made when you got married were founded, grounded, pointing towards that future experience. That even though my feelings are fluctuating, I have made a commitment to be driven by the engine, not the caboose. That's all that I'm trying to say. Now, that's the horizontal component. Now, the vertical component or the vertical covenant is when marriage is also made before God. And this is why cohabitation is against the scriptures. This is why it does not work. It's a violation of the very goal that you're trying to achieve. When you cohabitate, when you skip the covenantal component and the proclamation that our relationship, in the context of, once again, of making this marriage arrangement or marriage ceremony or this covenantal, is proclaiming more than simply ourselves. This is why we're moving into the breaking covenant effects. See, the breaking of the covenant affects not only one's spouse, but also one's relationship with God. Meaning, when you go through the breaking of that covenant, when you go through divorce, which is not the unforgivable sin, but I think the consequences are definitely deep and serious. Marriage possesses both horizontal accountability and vertical accountability. That's the bottom line. Number five, relationships, the relationship between love and law. The author is going to argue that law and love are not enemies. Instead, commitment protects love, promises create security, security produces intimacy, and intimacy deepens affection. I'm going to say this one more time because I think this is extremely helpful. Once again, the commitment, the covenant, driven by the engine versus the caboose, is going to protect love. So love is symptomatic, it seems to me, is the result of a life that is committed, not to the feelings, but committed to life, to build a life together. In my mind, that's part of the reason why we get married, or one of the main reasons, right? Again, is the megaphone, right? But it's building the life that actually honors and is proclaiming the life that is to come in the kingdom, that is to be consummated when Jesus returns. So it's the commitment that protects that love. Now, the promises that we make, especially at the beginning, making a promise with our future selves, right? That is, regardless of the fluctuation of our feelings, now is going to create that security that is in sickness and in health. Whether you're going through a season of prosperity or a season of drought, until death do us apart. So that brings the security. And then also the security is going to bring that intimacy and the oneness. And then ultimately that intimacy deepens affection. What's the point? That if you notice this word affection, it seems to me that eventually, if you are able to follow or to see the relation between love and law, is that affection or emotions, the caboose, must follow the engine and the cards. And that's exactly what we're describing. It's simply the following. So emotions or affection is involved. And yes, we do need them. It's part of who we are. We were created to have affections, but they must follow, in this case, the law. They must follow precisely what is right or righteousness. Feelings cannot sustain marriage. Again, I don't know if that is clear, but I'm just translating the word feelings for the word caboose in my illustration of the train. So feelings naturally fluctuate. Everybody changes. Is that a fair statement? Everybody changes. No one stays the same. Everybody changes. All that we're trying to say, especially as we navigate this type of readings and this type of teaching from this study, is that we want to make sure that the changes are moving us or they become the means towards the goal. And how do you keep the goal? How do you keep the main thing? The main thing is, once again, to understand that marriage is simply a megaphone. It's announcing the real marriage that is to come. So if you are not a Christian, it's going to be really hard for me to marry you or perform your ceremony. Why? Because if I'm going to perform your ceremony and I'm going to marry you and your future spouse, it's going to be through the lenses of what is to come. Is everything is to what is to come, right? If you think about suffering for us as Christians, we process the immediate through the ultimate. This is why we rejoice, not because of suffering, but in the middle of suffering, because for us, even death is not final. Physical death is not final. So the same thing happens with marriage. It simply means towards a greater end, which is, once again, the wedding of the Lamb, the final wedding between the church and Jesus of Nazareth. So in this case, feelings cannot sustain marriage. Why? For everything that just explained. Because if you make marriage ultimate, if you make it the capstone versus the cornerstone, you're setting yourself for failure. Why? Because feelings naturally fluctuate. That's what we just said. Feelings fluctuate. Examples include stress in life, illness in life, financial hardship, disappointment, and aging. Everybody changes. If marriage depends entirely upon emotion, then marriage becomes unstable. Instead, what we're looking for is commitment that provides stability during fluctuation, during the time where life is uncertain, during things that you have no control over. Now you find the security in the confidence that because of the promises of the God of the Bible, you will make it all the way to the end. So, if I can just put it to you this way, when it comes to commitment, when it comes to actually approaching these relationships through the lenses of the scriptures, what you're doing at the end of the day, if you are willing to see marriage as means to an end, a greater end, if you and I are willing to see marriage as a megaphone that is announcing the marriage to come, what happens is not going to be the formula or the promise that things are going to be is going to be better, or that there will be no fluctuation, or there will be no uncertainty. The promise is, or the guarantee is, that number one, he will be your shepherd, speaking of God, and because it's his idea, marriage is his idea, then what you are able to do in the middle of fluctuation, in the middle of instability, in the middle of all these unpredictable experiences of marriage, of trying to build a life together, what you're doing is you're putting the ball back on God's court, making God accountable of your relationship. So when you feel, when you sense, when you see that things are not working out, you call upon the one who made himself accountable, and he promised to sustain you. He promised that even though you may be like the parable of the wise and foolish men that build the house upon the rock and upon the sand. Remember that parable that Jesus describes in the book of Matthew? So now your marriage potentially has been built on the rock. In spite of all these transitions, in spite of all these changes, is built on the rock. Here's the point. Remember, both men, both houses will be shaken, will be hit by the storm. So, building your life and your marriage on the rock is not the guarantee, it's not an indictment, and you're not putting God on your debt that your marriage is not going to be hit. It's simply that as you get hit, God is responsible of the outcome. That's all that we're trying to say. So, if you were to ask me, after 29 years of marriage and going through so many experiences and phases and again fluctuations, because some of them were self-inflicted, some of them something that we just had no control over those things. Here's the bottom line. There is no way I can go through 29 years of marriage or continue and finish the race well, making myself responsible or accountable of the outcome. This is way beyond me. Now, I do play a part, and every one of us, Areli and I, we play a part in the conversation, but we're not the ultimate individual responsible. Why? Number one, because marriage was not our idea. This is God's original design to convey, to proclaim, to use it as a megaphone to announce the marriage that is to come. Secondly, our relationship, again, has a vertical experience and a horizontal experience or accountability. And as long as we remain focused that as important as the caboose is, the caboose must follow the engine. And the engine is the lordship, is the centrality of Jesus of Nazareth, who now listen to me, he chose and he made a decision 2,000 years ago to become the caboose, to become and be placed as if he was responsible for our downfall, for our rebellion. Paul says in Corinthians that the one who knew no sin for our sake literally became sin. So we can become the righteousness of God. And that righteousness makes us accountable to live a life of righteousness. Now, in this case, and this is where I'm going to close the conversation today. In this case, in the latter, as he closes the chapter, he speaks of actions shape feelings. So one of Keller's practical insights that he's going to bring in the book is how modern culture, caboose-driven culture, teaches feel first, then act. So if you feel it, you must do it. You must act upon it, right? This is why we are, oh my goodness, we're such a broken generation that we see as heroic to a certain degree those who, quote unquote, are honest with themselves. They come out of the closet and they are transparent and honest, declaring what they feel. That is completely nonsense. Because I'm going to say it again, if you're driven by the caboose, you're setting yourself for failure. So in this case, biblical wisdom is going to teach, instead of simply saying feel first, act later, or second, then act lovingly, then feelings often follow. Do what is right allowed the engine, which is the forensic presence, forensic leadership, forensic, and I'm speaking forensic as this is not the better version of yourself. This is the presence of Jesus through the Spirit of Jesus that is enabling you to act lovingly, regardless of the circumstances, in spite of what you're feeling. And then feelings eventually follow. The examples include serving, forgiving, encouraging, praying, sacrificing. Repeated loving actions gradually renew affection. Somebody tweet that. Somebody put that on Facebook. Somebody put that in Texas to somebody. Please, repeated loving actions gradually renew affection. And again, I'm not minimizing how the affections have been affected. I'm not minimizing what's taking place in life and through relationships and previous relationships, how much you were potentially a victim of abuse or betrayal. None of that is minimized. But if we can once again allow the Spirit of the living God become literally the overpowering presence at the engine level, then your thoughts and your feelings will submit to the leadership of the Holy Spirit. This is beyond simply therapy. This is beyond simply trying again and then, getting coaching and counseling. Those things are helpful, and if you need any of those things, go for it. Those are instruments and vehicles and great tools for you to work through the whole experience. But ultimately, what you need is the leadership, the presence of someone else. And this is the faithful one, which his name is Jesus. Romantic love matures. Stage one, infatuation. The characteristic of infatuation is idealization. You idolize the individual, excitement, strong attraction, limited knowledge. People often love an imagined version of the other person. That's exactly what happens in church revitalization. I said it at the beginning. Pastors tragically love the future version of the church instead of loving the real version of the church. So, moving from the ideal to the real, to me, that's key for revitalization. I think that's exactly the same concept that is applicable in marriage. Stage two is reality. So, you're moving from infatuation to reality. Here's reality. True character becomes visible. Now, hear me say this, especially if you're single. True character becomes visible. When it comes to true character, this is why life must be done in community. When you do life in isolation in an island, this is why church is non-negotiable. If you're a Christian, you are not simply saved from you're not simply saved from God or the judgment of God that is at the end of the era. This is why moving into eschatological, you are not simply saved from that. You're saved from the holiness, from the righteousness, from the wrath of God. That's number one, the number one thing that you're saved from. You're also saved from hell and damnation. That's eternal death or the second death. You'll never know that. But if you're a Christian, you're also saved from self. And the way that you're saved from self is coming into a community. Now, if you're a Christian, my assumption is that you're baptized. And baptism is coming out of the water, not simply to a new life or a down payment into that final resurrection from among the dead. But in reality, water baptism or believer's baptism is coming out into a family and community. Why am I emphasizing this whole concept of community? Because that's exactly what allows us to be saved from self. Because my tendency is to believe in God or in a God that actually endorses and enables my agenda, my story, my dreams, my desires. And if God is real, then he's supposed to work for me. Again, that's a mockery of the gospel. That's a distorted image of the real experience in Christianity. What am I saying this? Because translate that into marriage. If you're coming into marriage simply choosing a person, giving yourself to a person that is supposed to fulfill you, that is supposed to do what is expected, what you desire, the dreams that you have, and the expectations you have, you're setting yourself for failure, because the only person that can actually fulfill you is precisely the one who emptied himself so you can become, once again, free, not only from God, from hell, but also from self. And that's the person of Jesus Christ. So again, this concept of self-given, this concept that we're describing, which to me is completely foreign to our culture, is the understanding that now we're moving into this reality of true character that becomes visible. And that true character comes in the context of community. That's why you need the church, so you can hear the counsel of the from others about the person that you're dating or the person you want to marry. Weaknesses emerge, disappointment occurred, and conflict develops. That's the reality when it comes to, again, the stage two of the conversation. Stage three is mature love. Now you're moving into maturity. Now you're moving into building a life together. Now you're moving into oneness. You're moving into the goal of becoming the megaphone that announces the true marriage that is to come. Partners choose, couples choose one another again and again and again. Love becomes informed, becomes realistic, sacrificial, and resilient. Quitting is not an option. That's the point, right? Quitting is not an option. This mature love exceeds youthful romance. Now, this is the same principle that we apply in church revitalization. And I'm sorry that I'm going back and forth, because that's the world that I live in. And that's one of the things that I believe exemplifies everything that we're saying. Because in church revitalization, if you approach as a pastor, as a revitalizer, revitalization with a plan B, more than likely you're not going to make it. If you approach pastoral ministry thinking that if for whatever reason this doesn't work, I'm going to do something else, my recommendation, don't even try it. Just go and do whatever you're thinking plan B is. That should be plan A. Why? Because pastoral ministry, just like church revitalization and marriage, is extremely, extremely, extremely beautiful, but extremely hard. That's all that I'm saying. And if you enter marriage thinking that there might be a possibility that if it doesn't work out, then I'm going to go and do something else, my suggestion, stay single. That was my suggestion. I'm for marriage. And now, obviously, singleness for me is a synonym of staying pure sexually and morally, right? So, again, it's a both end of the conversation. Now, freedom through commitment. And number 9, modern culture teaches commitment reduces freedom. Now, the author is going to argue the opposite. Real freedom comes through permanent commitments. I'm going to say it again. Real freedom comes from through permanent, consistent, habitual commitments. And this is exemplified through marriage, parenting, vocation, friendship, and church membership. So, once again, single people, listen to the list. If the person that you're dating is not manifesting, expressing, crystallizing these landmarks of true freedom by habitual, in other words, if the individual cannot keep a job, I mean, I'm like, dude, you do have a serious problem. But I love him. I'll change him. No, that's not how it works. You want to see those traits prior to making the commitment. So in this case, this is why it's not enough to say, well, he's a Christian. The question is, what type of a Christian is it? I know that's a contradiction of terms when we, qualify Christianity, but in reality, we have so many versions of Christianity today that you have to be very specific. Is this the type of Christian that is led by the caboose? Is it the type of Christian that lives lives in isolation? Is it the type of Christian that has no accountability over him? What type of Christian is the individual? And for me, church membership is the very, very minimum commitment that you are describing in a sense of accountability. Commitment forms character, and character produces genuine freedom. That's what freedom is defined. The role of grace. Marriage exposes, here we go, listen to me. Marriage exposes, this is why through marriage, that's how you become an adult, right? This is why we promote early marriage versus delayed marriage. Why? Because singleness or delayed marriage, and this is going to sound harsh. I do not apologize for sounding harsh, but this is my conviction and then personal experience. The longer that you wait to get married, the more that you perpetuate exactly the opposite of the role of grace. Why? Because marriage exposes selfishness, exposes pride, impatience, insecurity, and sin. What's the point? That without marriage, for the most part, because you're driven by self-centeredness and egocentrism, typically in single life, and again, I'm making very radical statements. I'm not saying that every single person is selfish and is self-indulgent. All that I'm saying is that marriage by default is going to be the exposition of true character. In other words, who really, 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 really knows you is precisely the person that you married. And then obviously your children. And I'm saying this because what is going to bring to the surface marriage is not the perfect life, it's not the perfect relationship, it's not the Hollywood story or the Disney type of story that has a beautiful ending. What marriages exposes is precisely the process of sanctification, the process of purification that is removing precisely the selfishness and the pridefulness and the impatience and the insecurity, and ultimately is sin. Rather than destroying marriage, these discoveries become opportunities for grace, because the list is not describing my spouse, it's describing me. So when I see those trends in my wife or my husband, guess what? It's simply a reflection of who I am. Healthy marriages become laboratories of sanctification. This is the purification. This is where we move from boys to men. This is when if we're going to stick to the plan and move from being driven by the caboose and actually being driven by the engine, now this laboratory, this transformation takes place. Christ as the model of marital love. Ultimately, again, we're the megaphone, we're announcing the true marriage. The ultimate model is Jesus of Nazareth. Why? Because it is Christ who pursued his bride. It continues to pursue his bride. It is Christ who sacrificed, past tense, and continues to the sacrificial experience even today, in a sense that he is interceding for his church as he's sitting at the right hand of the Father up in heaven. It is Jesus that remains faithful. It is Jesus that has forgiven and forgave repeatedly, habitually. It is Jesus that loved, past tense, before he was loved. So this is why, I'm going to say this again. As much as this is the description, as much as this is the expression of the character of Jesus, that's exactly what has been given to the Christian. This is what we steward. This is what we manage, the character of Jesus. So Ephesians 5 becomes the theological foundation of everything that we're describing. Christ did not love because the church was loving. Christ loved to make the church lovely. Likewise, Christian spouses love in ways that encourage one another's growth into Christ likeness. Why? Because we are in for the long haul. We are here until death do us apart. So hopefully chapter 3 is helpful. Hopefully chapter 3 somehow, somewhere allows us to potentially go back to the book and read the whole narrative. I mean, he is an amazing writer. Speaking of Tim Keller and Kathy Keller, they are amazing on what they have produced and created. And I hope our conversations are somehow helping us to go back and take ownership on the study and find individuals, find relationships, especially in our marriages, if we're married, to engage into this type of conversations. Go back to the beginning and see the discussion questions and see if you can, again, bring a little bit of a dialogue over the presentation of today. I hope and you guys are making arrangements and preparations to go to church tomorrow, because again, it's simply the megaphone announcing the gospel, proclaiming the real marriage, which is between Jesus and the church. So please go to church tomorrow. God bless.